Ukrainian forces have broken through Russian defences in the south of the country while expanding their rapid offensive in the east. They're seizing back more territory in areas annexed by Russia and threatening supply lines for its troops. Russian-installed officials have acknowledged Ukraine's advances in the Kherson region, one of 4 that Russia illegally annexed last week. Ukrainian troops are said to have gained territory as much as 30 kilometres away from where the front stood just days ago.
Troops raising the flag allegedly in Kherson, which had just been illegally annexed by Russia. In Donetsk, another region Russia claims as its own, Ukrainians ride through in tanks, some of them captured and still bearing the Russian war symbol Z.
This technique comes from Lyman. It's Russian vehicle, and now this machine will work for our armed forces.
Though Russia recently announced it was annexing 4 regions of Ukraine, Ukrainian troops keep recapturing territory. They achieved their biggest breakthrough in the south since the war began, shortly after pushing soldiers out of the strategically important city of Lyman in the east. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the army has liberated new towns in a number of areas.
Today, the offensive movement of our army and all our defenders continued. There are new liberated settlements in several regions. Fierce fighting continues in many areas of the front.
It comes as President Putin faces increasing problems with manpower, logistics and morale, as well as thousands of men fleeing Russia after being called up to fight. In a morale boost for Ukraine, fighters who defended the Azovstal steel plant in the besieged city of Mariupol were reunited with their families. The Ukrainian troops were part of a prisoner swap brokered by Turkey, where the fighters will remain until the end of the war, when these families hope to be back together again for good.
DW's Nick Connolly is in Kyiv. How significant are the latest Ukrainian gains?
Well, certainly, we spent the whole summer expecting some kind of movement in Kherson. That was what the Ukrainian leadership was talking about endlessly. In the end, it didn't happen. All the activity was in Kharkiv, and Kherson was the sideshow. That is now definitely changing. As for the actual scale of these developments, it's pretty difficult to tell. The information kind of trickles down and out to us kind of here in Kyiv a day or two later. The Ukrainian army is very good at keeping all the details pretty secret. We actually find out more from Russian military bloggers, and they're certainly starting the blame game. So there's a real sense of panic on the Russian side, even among people who support this invasion, a sense that there's different parts of the Russian establishment blaming each other for these setbacks, and no real idea of how they can really end this Ukrainian advance. The mobilized forces, those newly called up people who often don't have any military experience, are not reaching the front lines in the numbers and with the training needed to really change anything about all this.
Nick, has Russia's illegal annexation of land changed anything?
We've not seen the Ukrainians, take any notice of this. The Ukrainian government and top figures here have repeatedly said that this is basically a bit of political theatrics and changes nothing on the ground legally, and that's obviously an opinion that's shared internationally. No one outside Russia has recognised these referendums or this annexation. Just to give you a sense of the chaos and the kind of meltdown going on in Moscow right now, we heard yesterday from Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, saying that they still hadn't quite decided on the exact borders of what they were going to annex, if they were going to claim the entirety of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as they are administrative regions, or if they were just going to claim the bits that had been under Russian control since 2014. As for Zaporozhye and Kherson, they said they would talk to the locals. So a sense that all this theatre in Moscow, this big event, the big kind of attempt to try and show that Russia was regaining initiative, is built on very, very shaky foundations, and a sense that Russia can't really get its story straight for now.
How are dropping temperatures going to change the dynamic?
Well, there's definitely a sense that this is all going to slow down in a couple of months' time once temperatures drop. That was always the pattern in Donbass since 2014, that winter saw far less in the way of fighting and movement on the front lines. We've seen Ukraine already call for help from Western countries in terms of supplies, winter uniforms, boots, and they are now, as we understand, on their way. I think the bigger kind of development there will be those mobilization forces from Russia. There is a sense that Russia is going for more than the 300,000 new troops that they talked about when this was announced, and there was upwards of 1 million soldiers probably coming this way. What qualifications they have, what training they'll have and what supplies is a different question, but there is a sense that Ukraine is now trying to basically make the most of this sweet spot right now where Ukraine often has more boots on the ground than Russia, and those Western weapons are making a real difference before Russia has a chance to restock and to resupply. So Ukraine trying to push back and double down until the winter stops things, and try and push those Russian front lines back as far as possible.
Nick Connolly, thanks for your extensive reporting throughout this war.
Let's get more now from Bradley Bowman. He's Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Good to have you on the day. Let's start with these reports out of Ukraine. What do they tell you about the course of the war?
Thanks for the opportunity to join you, and thanks for the question. They tell me that Vladimir Putin's unprovoked invasion is failing. It's too soon to declare victory, and I have a little bit more of a cautious approach on this. But the evidence is undeniable. The momentum is with Ukraine in the east and in the south. And Vladimir Putin has made these illicit annexation announcements, but he did that for 4 territories that his forces didn't even completely control and from which they were retreating, at least in part. And so, this is an attempt for him to show something tangible, to try to motivate the Russians to fight there more. And the response we've had after the partial mobilization announcement is we've had more Russians fleeing Russia than the invasion, the size of the entire invasion force on February 24th. So I think no matter what metrics you look at, this is not going well for Vladimir Putin, and Ukraine has the momentum for the moment.
And Bradley, as you say, far from anywhere near a sort of victory. There are anecdotal reports that this fighting has come at a heavy cost for Ukraine in terms of men, material. What do you know about the casualties and how that might impact Ukraine's ability to sustain this kind of momentum?
I want to better understand the costs on both sides, just as someone who analyzes these issues from a military perspective. But, to be honest with you, I'm not sure I trust most of the numbers I'm seeing. I mean, we know that Russia has lost more in 6 or 7 months than they did in a decade in Afghanistan. We know this has been really quite extraordinary and devastating in terms of Russian losses. And we know Ukrainians have paid a huge cost, both in terms of refugees, internally displaced persons, and also deaths and injury on the battlefield. But while there's been significant losses on both sides, what's remarkable to me is the difference in morale. It's just, in some ways, we're seeing what H.R. McMaster, former national security advisor under the Trump administration and chair of our center, has called a moral collapse of the Russian forces. And yes, they're sending some reinforcements, but in many cases, these reinforcements have little to no training. So imagine being sent to the front lines of a war where so many have already died with no training. And so combine that with the agility, bravery, effectiveness of the Ukrainians and their Western weapons, that's not going to go well for those new Russian recruits.
So that situation you paint for us dovetails into all these threats, both implicit and explicit, we're hearing from Putin and many of his allies about the use of nuclear weapons, whether those be strategic or tactical. Now, we've heard just yesterday David Petraeus, a former American general and CIA chief, have some pretty explicit thoughts about what a nuclear exchange might look like. Let's have a quick listen to what he had to say.
I mean, just to give you a hypothetical, we would respond by leading a NATO, a collective effort that would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see and identify on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also in Crimea and every ship in the Black Sea.
Now, that is an explicit and dramatic statement. I mean, that's NATO going up directly against Russia. What do you make of that kind of statement?
From the beginning, frankly, from before the February 24th invasion, my advice to anyone who would listen would be that we should do everything, we being Washington and our allies in Europe, should do everything in our power to help Ukraine defeat Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine while avoiding direct conflict with Russia for obvious reasons. And so that's why, for example, I opposed the establishment of a no-fly zone, which would require direct combat between U.S. and Russian forces to enforce that no-fly zone, while supporting sending every reasonable weapon we can to Ukraine. This recommendation by General Petraeus, whom I worked underneath in Afghanistan in 2010 and who is very knowledgeable on these issues, that's very specific and that's very aggressive and would obviously put the U.S. in direct warfare with Russia. So I think what he's, the genuine sense behind what he's saying is we need to put in Vladimir Putin's mind that the cost of doing so would outweigh any gain, right? That's the essence of deterrence, that you either can't accomplish your objective or that they would come at too high of a cost. And so we need to convey to him that the use of nuclear weapons, whether they be tactical or strategic, would be unwise because of he would not accomplish the objectives or the cost would be too great. And I sense General Petraeus is trying to do that. But directly attacking Russian forces would take things to a whole nother level that, frankly, Moscow and Washington were able to avoid for 4 decades during the Cold War.
Indeed, and I think anyone of our viewers who's seen The Day After, that movie from the 1980s, knows how these tit-for-tat kind of threats could very, very seriously escalate into a scary situation. Bradley, U.S. and Western partners viewing battle developments from afar, what does that mean for their support, their continued support for Ukraine?
I see no sign that Putin is going to back down. He's not exactly known for backing down. And so I think the burden of proof is on anyone that this is going to end quickly. We see wonderful momentum around Kharkiv and in the Donbass and around Kherson, but there's still Crimea, right? And there's other issues. And some retreats lead to routes, and some retreats lead to the consolidation of defensive lines. And so, you're starting to see some reluctance to continue to provide Ukraine the weapons they're asking for, like the Army tactical missile system, which would allow them to strike deeper than the weapons we're currently providing. I do worry that we're going to be so celebratory in celebrating the welcome success of Ukrainians that we're going to allow our support for them to slacken. And I would say now is not the time to slacken that support. Let's give them the means to defend their homes and defeat this invasion, while be very clear that we should not see attacks into Russia proper. And when I say Russia proper, I'm not talking about these 4 illicitly annexed territories, right? Because that's what Vladimir Putin wants. He wants us to stop supporting Ukraine. He wants the Ukrainians not to attack into Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia for fear of a nuclear response. But if we do that, that would set a horrible precedent in Europe. And by the way, Beijing is watching, and they're wondering whether they could attack Taiwan, for example, and then threaten a nuclear response and make America back down. And so I think the precedents we do or don't set here in terms of whether we're going to be cowed by nuclear saber rattling will have consequences on the European continent for years and years to come, and also in the Indo-Pacific.
Now, we've seen a report in the New York Times that U.S. forces in Europe want to overhaul how they train and equip Ukrainian troops. What does this tell us about the cooperation between the United States and its NATO partners?
I was critical of the Biden administration for being slow before the February 24th invasion to provide Ukraine the means it needs to defend against an invasion. But afterwards, they've moved with impressive agility in terms of bolstering NATO's eastern flank, helping Ukraine, and also helping with training, right? There was a big discussion in the March timeframe. Oh, hey, we only can provide Ukraine Russian and Soviet origin weapons. We didn't want to provide them American and other Western weapons because they'd never used them before. Well, that turned out not to be so difficult. We trained them in a few weeks, and now they're using American weapons there to great effect. And I would note that the British have a very impressive training program for Ukrainians that's been underway for a while now, where they're training basic recruits. And so if you buy what I'm saying, that this may not end anytime soon, then we're going to need to have plans both for the short, medium, and long term. And that's not just about the provision of weapons. They have to know how to use those weapons, how to sustain them, how to maintain them, and how to operate in a combined arms way on the battlefield. Something the Ukrainians are doing impressively already, but we can help them do it even better.
A very complicated and long process that you lay out for us. Bradley Bowman from the Center of Military and Political Power at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thanks for those views.
Thank you.